Beautifully read Psalm 13. I'm going to, for our second scripture reading, invite you to open your heart to what God says to you in a part of Paul's letter to the church in Rome. It's a church that is written to this church in persecution, and we're going to be looking at chapter 8, verses 24 through 28. There's Bibles that are there in front of you. If you brought your own Bible or have the Bible on an app on your phone and you want to read along, or just follow along with me. But Paul says this to the church in Rome in chapter 8, beginning with verse 24, "For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what one already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but that very Spirit intercedes with groanings too deep for words. And God, who searches hearts, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose." You know, we are beginning a new sermon series as we start this new kind of school year, church programmatic year. I'll say more about it. The sermon series is called Misquoted, Things That Jesus Didn't Actually Say. And so we'll get to that in a bit, but I'm sort of coming off a great week. This past week was able to spend some time with three of my closest friends, one that I met in second grade, one that I met in fifth grade, and one that I met in sixth grade. And our spouses, we all got together, spent some time together, and it was awesome. You can imagine, those of you who have friends that have spanned decades, when we get together, there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discussion, we're a lot to handle. I wouldn't invite you, it's not for the faint of heart. We kind of go at each other in ways that took a while for our spouses. One spouse really still, I don't think, has grasped the concept. It's not always for everybody, but we were talking together and I was sharing with them a little bit about this sermon series and some of the misquotes that I have found that people have been attributed to have said. And one in particular that I came across was by Marie Antoinette. Now, my guess is that many of you know, what is Marie Antoinette so famous for having said? I mean, I love being a part of an educated people. Yes, let them eat cake. Attributed to her response when being told about how poor people in France were not able to even have bread. And so her response was, well, then let them eat cake. It sort of was a way of capturing and highlighting the disconnect, her complete lack of awareness and mindfulness to the plight of poor people during that time. The only problem is she never actually said that. Now, this morning, someone challenged me on this. I said, Google it. I don't oftentimes give you permission right now in church. You Google it. Did Marie Antoinette actually say, let them eat cake? The answer is no. Historians have found that she never actually said that. It was attributed to her many, many years later. And yet, that is the quote that is so attached to her. It has shaped her reputation. And can you just imagine if the thing that you were remembered for was something you didn't even say, right? Not just your friends remembered it, not just your country, but history recalls you for having said something that you never actually said. Her entire legacy is tied to a quote that she never uttered. It's the power, I think, that can come with a misquote. Right? Sometimes a phrase gets repeated so often that people stop asking whether or not it's actually true. And that idea is at the heart of this series that we're going to be kind of considering this fall. Because I think the same thing can happen in the church, and I think the same thing can happen with our faith. Christians oftentimes use phrases that they assume comes from Jesus in the Bible, and they're phrases that sound biblical, they sound comforting, but neither Jesus nor the Bible actually ever says them. And oftentimes, these phrases can lead us to believe some things about God that are simply not true, and perhaps aren't even healthy. And so this sermon series, Misquoted, things that Jesus didn't actually say, is going to be for us an opportunity to reconsider some of those things and to sort of reform a healthier understanding of God and a healthier theology. Because some of the phrases that we're going to look at, they certainly sound biblical, and they are maybe and probably well-intentioned. Some are things that Christians say to comfort one another. Candidly, we're not doing this so that we will all feel bad about some of the things that we've said at times. We will say phrases that no doubt I have said, that you have said. And our intent is to not have us wallow in having to reconnect and reach out to all the people we said the phrase to 2 decades ago and apologize for misquoting Jesus, but to instead kind of reconsider some of these things. Because while they may contain a grain of truth, they oftentimes end up communicating a theology that Jesus never taught and that the Bible never intended. And so today's phrase is one that no doubt we're familiar with. We perhaps have had it said to us. We've said it to somebody else. And today's phrase is, everything happens for a reason. Right? You ever heard that phrase? Everything happens for a reason. You ever said that phrase? Oh, Robbie up here, nope, never misquoted Jesus. All right, well, maybe you should just endure the persistent pain you're going to have to endure for the next little bit. Everything happens for a reason, right? When somebody loses their job, everything happens for a reason. When the diagnosis doesn't come back, everything happens for a reason, Steve. Or when the relationship doesn't end up where we imagined it would end up, or the diagnosis, the health, the circumstance doesn't go the way that we had planned or expected. Hey, everything happens for a reason. A loved one dies unexpectedly. Everything happens for a reason. Tragedy. And while it is well intended, and I really do believe that when people say that, it's with good intentions, most people aren't trying to be insensitive. They're trying to offer hope. But have you ever noticed that if you have been the one that has heard that, so oftentimes it doesn't accomplish what it's intending to accomplish? And I can share from my own experience. I think I've shared on a number of occasions. Many of you know that my mom was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and when I was 9 years old, I started caring for her. When I was in 6th grade, she started using a wheelchair full-time. And you can imagine a 6th grader trying to process his mom losing her mobility and ability to walk. And then in high school, as I was very involved in my youth group, I was trying to process what was going on in my life. And an adult advisor that is still one of my favorite people said to me, "Hey, Steve, everything happens for a reason." And I know he was trying to help. And I know he wanted to be caring. But it actually created a problem. And it might have even made things worse. Because what I then had to wrestle with, the problem that I struggled with was, well, wait, so God is causing this? Or God is doing this to my mom for me? Or somehow God caused the pain, or God orchestrated this heartbreak? And if that's true, then there's a lot of other questions that we have to wrestle with. Like, did God cause the person to go over the center line and strike our loved one or ourselves in a car? Or did God cause cancer or the abuse or the depression or the natural disaster? Is that what we're saying about God? And I think most of us sort of intuitively, maybe instinctively recoil from those things. We don't really believe that God would do that, but I think that's often where everything happens for a reason unintentionally leads us. The truth is that while God is sovereign over all things, that is not the same as saying God is the micromanager of all things. There is a profound difference between God working through everything and God causing everything. And I think our passage from Romans chapter 8 speaks to this. And all too often in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, it's quoted without really understanding the verses around it. I actually just read it without reading the verses around it. And it's important for us to understand that Paul isn't writing from a place of comfort and ease. If we note this letter, this passage in its context, what we know is just a few verses earlier, Paul speaks about creation groaning, about human beings groaning, about the Spirit groaning. Right? The entire chapter in Romans 8 is filled with this longing, this suffering, waiting, and uncertainty. Paul describes a world that is not yet what God intends it to be, to a people who are experiencing great persecution. Creation is broken, people are hurting, life is difficult, things are going wrong, and into that world, Paul speaks these words. Paul shares this truth, and in verse 28, he says, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purpose." It's a beautiful promise that's so oftentimes misunderstood because we have to note what Paul does not say. Paul does not say all things are good. He does not say all things are good. Cancer is not good. Depression is not good. War isn't good. Poverty, hunger isn't good. Death isn't good. Paul never says that suffering itself is somehow wonderful. And he also doesn't say that God causes all things. Instead, he says, even in this broken world, a world that is groaning, God is still at work. God is still doing something. And that is a much more tangible and pragmatic hope that people are supposed to hold on to. Because that's the world I think that we actually live in. I think that we can resonate with that world where everything, not a world where everything happens the way that we plan it or prefer it to be, but a world where things happen that break God's heart, where people misuse their freedom, a world where people are continuing to suffer from injustice and hatred. A world where sin has consequences and the creation itself is fractured. And yet God continues to work redemption within that world. Some of us may know that Kate Bowler was a Christian author and a professor, and at 35, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And she had spent much, if not most, of her life sort of occupying a Christian space that had a version of Christianity that suggested that everything was a part of God's plan. Everything happened for a reason. And that faithful people were the recipients of God's blessing. And then cancer entered her life, and the picture suddenly, as it has for so many of us in our own experiences, changed as some of those easy answers or trite words sort of started to ring hollow. They really failed to connect with the reality of what life was for her. People would say things to her like, God's got a reason for this, or God needed this to happen, or this is all part of God's plan. But eventually, she says, she started to respond with a simple observation, and that is that sometimes life is just not fair. Sometimes terrible things happen, and our hope is not found in explaining them away. Our hope actually is found in God's presence within suffering, which is this remarkably biblical affirmation. Right? When Lazarus dies, Jesus doesn't explain the reason to Mary and Martha. He weeps. When the disciples are freaking out in the chaos of a storm and wind and waves and everything, Jesus doesn't show up with this philosophical explanation. He climbs into the boat with them. The Christian faith has never primarily been about explaining suffering. It has been about God's presence in the midst of it. What Romans 8 actually promises is not that everything happens for a reason. The promise is much more profound than that. The promise is that God refuses to abandon us. The promise is that no circumstance is beyond God's reach, and that God can weave redemption from the fragments of a broken world. Now, last night I changed my sermon. And I changed it because sometimes it feels like it's just me. Maybe this is how your life goes as well, but I am oftentimes amazed at how my life just seems to unfold in this way where there's this convergence of things. And yesterday afternoon, I did a memorial service for a childhood friend of mine. Her dad died. They grew up 4 houses, 5 houses from me, had been a part of my life for 5 decades. And so I was over at Lafayette Arena Presbyterian Church doing this memorial service for Larry. And at this service, one of the speakers was a guy that I had grown up with and gone to high school with. Now, I'll try not to bog down in all the details, but Larry, who had passed away, later in his life had become sort of a supporter of art. He was an art distributor, and he supported artists and would get them shows and other things. And so he had mentored this friend of mine that I had grown up with. And this friend spoke at his service. And afterwards, I was connecting with my friend who had been an artist for the last 40 years. And as we were talking, he was sharing with me, I was kind of curious about his projects and his art. And he shared with me about this project that he's almost finished. And he didn't have a picture. I haven't seen any of his work, actually. I couldn't see any of it. But I wanted a picture so bad because he said that he really likes to do art that kind of draws out and reflects the emotions that he feels, the intensity of emotion, and some of that's bright and some of that's dark. And he was talking about how he had gone through this very dark season, and in this dark season, he had taken something very valuable, and in his depression and loneliness, he had thrown it, and it had shattered. And that his project was, he had collected all of the shattered pieces of this thing, and he was finishing this mosaic that he was making out of these shattered pieces. Right? And as he was describing it, he's talking about the edges and everything and how it was just everywhere, but that he took the pieces and had created this thing, and something beautiful was emerging from these shattered pieces. And I'm just listening to this going, can you come preach on Sunday? It just sounded to me so much more accurately what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 8. He's describing a God who is constantly redeeming, healing, restoring, bringing good out of circumstances that were never good to begin with. Taking the shattered pieces of the world and our lives and constantly trying to recreate something that is imaginative and beautiful and creative. See, the Christian faith does not promise that everything happens for a reason. It promises that no matter what happens, God refuses to let suffering have the final word. It promises that no darkness is so deep that God's light cannot find it. It promises that no loss is so great that God's love cannot hold it, that no life is so broken that God cannot begin to restore it. Romans 8 does not tell us that everything is a part of God's plan. It tells us that in all things, God is working toward redemption. And so the better phrase, perhaps, is not everything happens for a reason. A better phrase might be that God is with us in everything that happens. That's the promise of Romans 8. Not that every tragedy is God's plan, not that every hardship is secretly a blessing, but that there is nowhere we can go and nothing we can face where God is absent. Nothing. In our joy, God is with us. In our grief, God is with us. In our doubt, in our uncertainty, in our sadness, God is with us. In our waiting, God is with us. And because God is with us, we can face whatever comes next with strength and with purpose and with hope. That's the promise, that God is with us in everything that happens. Amen.